Welcome to this Friday's Independent Sage meeting with the news this week that the Delta variant now accounts for more than 90% of cases in the UK. And with infections rising rapidly, the government's plans for the 21st of June, when remaining restrictions are meant to be lifted, are now looking extremely uncertain. What is certain is that the new Delta variant is more transmissible than previous variants and is spreading most quickly among school-aged children. So this brings more urgency to questions like, should we have better mitigations in place in schools? And should we be extending our vaccine offer to children? To help us answer that question of vaccines in children, we have two special guests with us today. So I'm very pleased to welcome to the panel today Professor Beate Kampmann, Professor of Paediatric Infection and Immunity and Director of the Vaccine Centre at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and Professor David Salisbury, who is Associate Fellow at Chatham House and former Director of Immunisation at the Department of Health. So we'll be having a very interesting, in-depth conversation with them after we've heard from Dr. Kit Yates with the latest facts and figures. Over to you, Kit.
Great, thanks, Alice. So, I'm at the wrong end of the presentation. Never mind, there we go. So I'm going to talk very briefly, just do 5 minutes because our guests are time limited. So I'm going to start by talking about cases and then look at hospitalisations and what the rise in cases means for hospitalisations. Then I'll look at vaccination, and then I'll finish by talking about school cases and school absences, which will lead us on to discussion about childhood vaccination, which we'll go straight into after the data. So firstly, cases, we have come a long way down since January, of course, but cases are starting to rise. You can see on the right-hand edge of the plot here. In particular, if I zoom in, you can see that we are now experiencing the highest case rates since the end of February, early March. So those gains that we made over those 2 months between the start of March and start of April have been eroded quite quickly. Cases are rising relatively rapidly at the moment. Looking at positivity rates, just to make sure that cases, it's not just rises in testing, you can see that England and Wales are rising. That's red and green there. Scotland is rising even faster. It's been rising earlier. Their Delta variant third wave, if you like, or fourth wave, depending on how you want to call it, started earlier than in England and Wales. Northern Ireland, it's falling, but that's the only good piece of news really in terms of positivity rates. This is the map that Christina showed in her presentation a couple of weeks ago, showing where the cases were in the UK. This is an update for yesterday, and you can see that actually cases are spreading outwards from this sort of central band where the main conurbations in the United Kingdom are. And you can see that case rates are getting worse. If I just flash back, you can see that there's much more black and red on the screen than there was previously. So this is spreading throughout the country. We know that Delta is everywhere in every region now. Looking at hospitalizations, this is the picture again since September last year, and it doesn't look like there's a huge uptick. This is for England in particular. It doesn't look like there's a huge uptick at the moment. If I zoom in a little bit, you can see that it has been rising for the last couple of weeks since mid-May, but it isn't rising particularly quickly, or it doesn't seem to be rising particularly quickly. And if we look at occupancy, instead of just hospital admissions, this is the people who are in hospital, you can see that again, it is rising, but it's only very, very mild at the moment. So there are a number of reasons for this. Firstly, hospitalizations lag cases by a week or so. So we won't have seen the impact of the most recent rises in cases. Secondly, people who are getting infected at the moment are younger, and vaccines are making a difference. So we're not seeing people, or as many people, who are as severely ill, which is reducing the number of people in hospital. Also, we're seeing perhaps that people are not spending as long in hospital, so that occupancy isn't rising as quickly as admissions are, although we're not seeing people being discharged as quickly as they're being admitted, so occupancy is still rising slightly. Now, this picture in England is slightly misleading. If you look at Scotland, who are further into their third wave, you can see that their hospital admissions have been rising faster and more noticeably since early May, in fact. And again, their occupancy has been rising, again, less steeply than admissions, but their occupancy has also been rising since around early May again, and you can see it's more stark than it was in the English picture. Again, if we look at the Northwest, where we know they've been struggling with the Delta variant there earlier than most of the rest of England, we can see that hospital admissions are rising more quickly now, and again, occupancy is rising more quickly than in the whole of England, or in England as a whole. So it's not to say that the link between hospitalizations and cases has been completely broken by vaccination. We hope it's been broken somewhat, but if we allow huge numbers of cases to spread, then we would expect to see large numbers of hospitalizations, although fewer than we might have expected this time last year or in September, for example. In terms of vaccinations, we are still going on at a good pace. We had a dip because of the bank holiday over here. We've risen up a little bit, but it's sort of disappointing to see we haven't risen right back up to the heights that we had before, especially now that we know that it's incredibly important to get those second doses into people to give them the best protection against the Delta variant, which is now dominant across the whole of the UK. In terms of looking at the population of people who's been vaccinated, across the whole of across the 4 different nations of the United Kingdom, we have fewer than 45% of people have been given double jabs. That's the orange here, people who've had both doses. So over 55% of the total population, so that's including children, have not got the best protection from the Delta variant. So although we should be pleased that we're getting somewhere, the majority of the population still are not double jabbed yet. So we need to keep going with that. And finally, I'll touch on schools and absences in schools to lead on to the debate we're going to, or the discussion we're going to have about childhood vaccination. This is from the ONS infection survey, which came out at lunchtime today. You can see that the biggest rises in prevalence are in school-age children, particularly in secondary school-age children, but also, perhaps more worryingly, in this age bracket between 35 to 49, which may comprise the parents of school-age children, or the majority of parents of secondary school-age children will probably fall into this age bracket. So you can see cases rising in every age group, but most rapidly in school-age, secondary school-age, and in perhaps parental age. Looking at absences from schools, so this chart's a little bit complicated. Last week we had a total of 136, in the last week of data we have, so this is on the 28th of May, in fact, we had a total of 136,700 pupils absent from school for COVID-related reasons. Only about 4,500 of them were due to confirmed cases, 19,000 suspected cases, but actually 90,000 roughly are people isolating because they've been in contact with someone with a confirmed case or a suspected case, and in school, and 25,000 who are isolating because they've been in contact with a case out of school. So this is a large number of pupils across primary and secondary. If we look just at primary schools, now this data shows you the percentage of pupils that were absent, so that's the bar graphs here and here, and the absolute numbers, that's the blue curve here, which corresponds to this left-hand axis. You can see that there were significant rapid rises rising up to the Easter break, and then when we came back after Easter, we started off at a low level, but that again is rising, or has been rising over the last half term, up to about 2% of children missing school. So although schools are nominally open, children, not insignificant proportion of children, are missing school because we're not controlling transmission in schools. The same picture is roughly true in secondary schools as well, slightly lower numbers overall, but a similar picture in secondary schools. And again, the breakdown for the different reasons for absence are given by these colour codes here. So again, relatively few due to confirmed cases and larger numbers due to school contacts. So that's where I'll finish. I'll just summarise saying cases are continuing to rise relatively quickly. They are doubling every 9 days or so, which is roughly the same sort of rate we saw last September, maybe a little bit slower. Hospitalizations are rising more slowly, which is good. We are seeing fewer serious cases compared to what we would have seen last September without the vaccination programme. But if you look at Scotland and the Northwest, then you can see that these numbers of hospitalizations will or may start to rise quickly in future as we get further through this wave. Vaccination's going well, but we still have over 55% of the population, including children, not fully protected with 2 doses of the vaccine. We know we need that to keep people as safe as possible. And also we have school absences being a growing problem, particularly actually in areas like the Northwest, which are further ahead into their third wave, I should say, not peak. So it raises the question, should we vaccinate children? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm just going to give an introduction to our two guests, although I'm not sure Beata is... Oh yeah, there you are, Beata, thanks. Great, good to see you. Okay, so we have Professor Beata Kampman, who's from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She's a Professor of Paediatric Infection and Immunity, the Director of the Vaccine Centre. She's a theme leader at the MRC unit in the Gambia, and she directs the Childhood Infection Immunity Research Programme in the UK and in Sub-Saharan Africa. I could go on, but we are time limited, so I'll stop there. And similarly, we also have Professor David Salisbury, who's Director of Immunisation at the Department of Health. He's a Fellow of the Royal College of Physicians, a Fellow of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, a Fellow of the Faculty of Public Health, an Honorary Chair at Imperial College, and also plays a significant role in the World Health Organization. So we have two incredibly eminent guests to talk about childhood vaccination, particularly vaccinating children against COVID. I'm planning to share or co-chair this session with a colleague, Gabriel, if he comes on the call. But for now, I'll just start off by asking the first question. Perhaps I can start with you, Beata. Is it safe to vaccinate children against COVID?
Yeah, it's obviously the critical question, and thanks very much for inviting me to share my thoughts on this. As you all know, the safety database on children is still somewhat limited because they weren't initially included in the clinical trials, although the Pfizer vaccine trials included teenagers up to the age of 15, and that was the initial approval, also including that age group. And more recently, we've seen the data from their study of about 2,290 adolescents between the age of 12 and 15, which led to the approval not only in the US, but also by MHRA and EMA. So there is by the regulatory authorities, there is enough of a safety database to give this approval. Whether 2,200 children included in these trials gives us enough confidence as pediatricians, as parents, which is a really important consideration, is something we will no doubt discuss this afternoon. Mm-hmm. And, we need to sort of think about biological plausibility, why it should be any different in children. Usually the studies are done in a sort of age de-escalation pattern, and the numbers of children who would be enrolled in vaccine studies is quite considerable if we're looking at safety data. So I think we have to say the safety database is limited. So far, there have not been any alarming signs, and I'm going to park any discussion about these myocarditis cases until we want to go there. There is no proven association at the moment, but people are asking the questions. And as in all of the discussion around COVID, it comes down to some degree to a risk-benefit ratio and appreciation of the serious follow-up procedures that are put in place.
Great. Okay, thank you. And David, sort of following up on that, are there reasons to assume that these vaccines might work differently in children? And is there real world data from children that have been vaccinated so far, which is there anything we can conclude from that real world data from Israel or the US, for example?
When we talk about children, we're really talking so far about adolescents and children, just below the age of adolescence. And I don't think that there are good reasons to imagine that vaccines will perform differently in a 13 or 14 or 15-year-old to an 18 or 19 or 20-year-old individual. So I'm comfortable, certainly, on that score. And I don't see that that's a huge difference. In terms of real-world experience, we know that there are now many young people who have been vaccinated, and teenagers, adolescents who've been vaccinated in the United States, and they will be being followed for safety reasons. And I don't believe there have been any concerning safety signals so far outside of the clinical trials.
Okay, thank you. That's comforting to know, I think. So the next thing that I'm interested in finding a bit more out about is there are multiple different arguments for vaccinating children, I suspect. How, perhaps Beata, you could come to this one first. How do we feel about it as an argument for reaching herd immunity and protecting other people in our society, not necessarily just as a benefit to children?
Yeah, I mean, this is really dominating the discussion at the moment, whether we would be vaccinating the children to prevent disease in the spectrum of that age group. And as we all know, fortunately, children haven't been, on the whole, affected very badly by COVID-19. And therefore, the main reason to vaccinate children is really to cut transmission. And as we're having more and more adults vaccinated and hopefully more and more people fully vaccinated, the burden of transmission or the data disproportionately, I think, now locate to the pediatric age group where we're talking about transmission in schools, kids being sent home because of being contacts, etc. So the focus is slightly shifting. Although there is not all of a sudden a higher transmissibility of this virus in children than there's been before. It's just the proportion of transmission that occurs is now locating a bit more to the age group that hasn't yet been fully vaccinated. And to some degree, your data that you just showed on the 35 to 49-year-olds supports that as well, because these are also the people who are not yet fully vaccinated, and yet you can see them congregate in hordes at school gates on a daily basis when I walk down my road. So I think it's obviously a concern, but it is more concern to vaccinate because we want to really cut transmission and get to spectrum of herd immunity. That's not negating the serious consequences of the post-inflammatory syndrome of COVID that we've also seen in pediatrics.
Yeah. So David, there's definitely an argument from a societal point of view to vaccinate children. Beata's made that quite clear. What are the benefits of vaccinating children for children themselves?
Well, I think there are certainly benefits in both terms of the acute disease and the prevention of long COVID. There are data just released in the US surveillance data, the MMWR, that do show that young people do end up in intensive care with COVID-19 disease. They are not spared from intensive care admission. And if you look at, as a comparison against seasonal flu, then the hospital admissions for seasonal flu are less as a proportion than they are for COVID-19. So it's not trivial, and we should not attempt to trivialize it and just say, oh, don't worry, children are spared. I think that just as in other vaccine-preventable infections, if children contribute to transmission, then they share in the responsibility to try to stop transmission. They're not spared from that responsibility. And they benefit personally by being protected, and they contribute to the protection within our community. And I think that those are good reasons why they should be part of the vaccine program. We have other examples where there is some benefit to the child recipient, but a considerable benefit to the community. And to me, the strongest example is the prevention of rubella, the prevention of German measles, by vaccinating very young children. We vaccinate children to prevent rubella when they're just a year of age. The issue here is that rubella is a mild infection in the child. But if that child's pregnant mother or that child's mother's pregnant friends catch rubella, then the effect on the unborn baby can be devastating. And we vaccinate young children to stop them infecting pregnant mothers. And I think that the argument here is very similar. We would be vaccinating children for their own benefit, and they contribute to transmission, and therefore they would be contributing to the protection of our community. Thanks.
Yeah. So we see this in flu as well, where we vaccinate children yearly for flu, primarily hopefully to prevent transmission to their grandparents, I guess, quite a lot of the time. Beata, do you think there's an argument for vaccinating children in order to help keep them in schools as well, to stop these absences that I highlighted in the data?
Yeah, I mean, I've got two colleagues off, just to give you an anecdotal example, because their children have been sent home from school because they're being exposed. So this is clearly causing a huge amount of disruption to education. I mean, I think the primary thing to consider is that the teachers in those schools and those people who have the risk factors of being severely affected by COVID as a disease are protected, and they should be primarily covered by this immunization program whilst we're waiting to see how much we can downscale it to other age groups. And I think in terms of avoiding that children lose more time in education, there is a point to be made. I mean, what we also have to be honest about is that the understanding of transmission in vaccinated people is not yet 100%. And in fact, there's a study just been initiated by Public Health England to randomize parents of children who have been exposed to or who are actually sick with COVID at home to, if they're fully vaccinated, to spend either time at home or go back to work with daily lateral flow assays. So this is something we really, really need to nail, because in the US, for example, you are not subjected to further self-isolation. So it's all a question of the health policy that's pinned around that once we've reached a degree of herd immunity through vaccination.
Mm. And this is we've heard quite a lot about anti-vax people. We've heard a lot about people who are vaccine hesitant. Is it anti-vax to be concerned about getting your children vaccinated, or is it a rational concern? David, perhaps you could come in first on that one.
Of course, it's a rational concern, and we take safety of vaccination for ourselves seriously, and we take safety of vaccination for our children and our grandchildren also very seriously. So there's nothing wrong with saying, I am concerned, I want to know that this is safe, I want to know that this is effective, I want to know that this is the right thing to do. But once you have come to that point, I think you move on and say, yes, this is the right thing to do, and we should be doing it. I'd like to come back to Beata's just last comment, because it is true that we don't know the extent of reduction of transmission that vaccines will provide. I'm not persuaded that knowing that number will help us hugely, because there isn't a right answer to the question. If the reduction was 10%, well, that's not as good as if the reduction was 20%, which wouldn't be as good as if the reduction in transmission was 50%. And it would be fantastic if the reduction in transmission was 90%. But once we know the answer, it doesn't really help us terribly much, other than to say, well, thank goodness there is some reduction in transmission from being vaccinated. So whilst I agree it's going to be good to know, I'm not sure how much it'll change.
I think it would strengthen sorry, David, if I might come back to that. I think it would strengthen the confidence of the buy-in of the parents who might, be, and I don't really want to use the word anti-vax here, because I don't think these are anti-vax people. I think these are parents, and many of us in this audience might be parents. The first question we would ask ourselves is, if the vaccine was available, would I give it to my teenage child? And yes, I would. And I have to address questions from, people around me saying, well, so if there's still transmission, what does it actually matter? And if I have great confidence that actually transmission is significantly reduced, David, and I think it strengthens the argument to say, actually, we're not just doing it for the benefit of the individual child, but actually for the community, and that will work. Don't you think, if you knew it was significantly lower?
I'm sure that's right. What I'm just trying to say is that there isn't a number that will help us to say this side of the line it's fantastic, that side of the line it's not so fantastic. Of course, it helps us in the assurance that we can give to people that this is the right thing to do.
So one thing that people quote to me on Twitter quite often is that these vaccines are experimental and we shouldn't be giving them to our children. Now, they have obviously been through rigorous safety procedures. How would you, David, perhaps to start with, how would you come back to someone who suggested that to you on Twitter or in the street?
The number of doses that have been given is way beyond anything that you could view as experimental. We know that the regulators have insisted on very careful follow-up in the clinical trials and in post-marketing. so that we can continue to monitor with great care about the ongoing safety. I don't believe that these are experimental. The difference that we, compared with other vaccine introductions, is that the area under the curve is so huge, although the time to acquire that knowledge has been relatively quick. We've had huge rollout in many different circumstances of these vaccines, and they have been followed very carefully for safety purposes. And I think we should be confident that the regulators are looking at all of our best interests and doing it with the utmost diligence. Thanks.
Great. And so one last question from me before I pass over to Gabriel, who I know has a couple of other questions he's interested in asking. And this is quite a big one. This is another argument people use for not vaccinating children is, and I guess the question is, should we be vaccinating our children who are ostensibly at lower risk of serious complications from COVID when some countries around the world haven't been able to vaccinate their most vulnerable people? Should we be donating our vaccines to those countries instead of vaccinating our children, or is that actually a false dichotomy? So maybe, Beata, you could start on that one.
Yeah, I mean, vaccine equity is a serious issue, and it's quite pleasing to see that there seems to be some sort of beauty contest going on at the G7 in Cornwall at the moment, which country can come up with more donations. And I can only say, yeah, bring it on, because these doses are needed internationally. But I don't think that we will necessarily use the same contingency that might be, applicable to a vaccine program here for teenagers, younger children in the UK, that is the same aliquot that would necessarily go to a low and middle income country via the COVAX initiative. So COVAX needs two things. It needs donations of vaccines and it needs future investment. And it's only when we have both of those will we end up in an area where there's supply enough to guarantee this, and we're nowhere near it. And I think it's a false dichotomy, but I think it's good to not lose the global perspective over who's really at high risk of serious harm from this horrible viral disease.
And David, I'd be interested to hear your perspective before I hand over to Gabriel on that issue of should we be vaccinating children versus vulnerable people in other countries?
Well, it's not an either or. Of course it's not. It's both, in my view. And if you looked at the roughly number of doses you'd need to do the 13 to 17-year-old in this country, it's 5 million. Well, that's lost in the rounding of the numbers of doses. I mean, our Prime Minister wants to vaccinate the world by the end of 2023. There are two big issues for me about the global donations. The first is, of course, surplus vaccine must be made available to countries where the needs are huge. But I do have concerns about the ability to implement vaccination when those doses become available in countries that don't have adult vaccine programs. They may do fantastically well at vaccinating young children, but they don't have targeted programs at older people and healthcare workers. And if those are the priorities, being flooded with vaccine won't necessarily get it to all of the people as fast as they need it. So it's not either or, it's both, but it's implementation as well as volumes of vaccine. Thanks.
Can I just add one comment to that? Having just assisted in the rollout of the vaccines in the Gambia, you're quite right, it's a challenge, but it's also not helped by donating doses of vaccines that have an expiry date of 3 months. So I very much hope that the massive amounts of vaccines that are now being promised are not the ones that are sitting in our fridges and freezers somewhere here that are going to expire, in the next 3 months, because it's a massive taking, and it has primarily been managed by PI programs. And you're quite right. Although having said that, these countries are also very much used, as you know, to mass campaigns, for example, measles campaigns, for example, polio campaigns. And these models have been used to roll out the COVID vaccines as well. What has worried me more is that because of the COVID vaccine rollout, various other immunizations haven't happened. So, of course, there's limited capacity and the scale up can only be so much, but it would be helped if there was a relatively long expiry date to the vaccines, because people eventually do get it done.
From my previous experience it's much, much harder to give away vaccines that you already have taken possession of. There are issues about liability, issues about guaranteeing cold chain, and there are issues about, of course, as Beata has said, the shelf life already being eaten into. Far easier is to give away your access to vaccines that may be under contract before you actually take ownership of them.
Those are really, really important points to consider. Thank you both so much. I'm going to pass over to Gabriel for 5 more minutes. I think we can afford to spend on this before we move into questions. So Gabriel, please.
Thanks very much. I'm very interesting discussion on equity and vaccines. I'm really interested in equity and vaccination. And we've seen across the UK really, I think, quite substantial differences between different groups of society in the uptake of the vaccination. Whether you get that down by housing tenure, where people in private rented accommodation have a very much lower uptake, people who have never worked or are unemployed, people from some minority ethnic groups. And I'm really worried, are we paying enough attention to that issue of equity in vaccination? Because it strikes me that we're leaving populations who will not have substantial population immunity, potentially. And we also don't seem really to have the infrastructure in place to deliver good vaccination programs at a very local level, because it's quite unclear who's in charge. You know, like many other public health functions, it's being split between different agencies, with the NHS responsible for vaccination, the public health locally is in the local authority, and general practitioners, of course, have a role as well. But in relation with different organisations, I'm really interested in views how we can tackle this issue of equity in vaccination in communities. Whichever of you would like to go first.
Well, I think this is not a COVID vaccine specific issue. This is an issue that has been, a problem in the immunization system in general. We have had much lower uptake of vaccines by ethnic minorities, for example, for a number of years. And if you look at the Public Health England data, it is quite clear that there isn't equity. I think, having followed and to some degree participated in the rollout since really December and January now, I think the situation has improved. And I think it has improved by acknowledging the granularity of support you have to have at the local level, and in particular with community advocates and role models that are coming in from communities where maybe the uptake hasn't been great because of pre-existing vaccine hesitancy. This is a difficult subject because there are so many factors that play into that. And I think it has improved, and I think we have the data to show it has improved. I'm not saying the job is done, but overall the efforts that have been put against that, I think, have had some traction, and we are now seeing more people vaccinated in the communities that initially had a real access issue. I don't know. I mean, I can't give you, a breakdown of the communities within the country now, but overall, I thought the data showed that things had improved for ethnic minorities, at least. David, you might have a better overview.
No, I mean, better. I think you've answered that, right to the core of the issue. We're very good at criticizing ourselves, but actually, our vaccine performance is pretty much second to none in terms of trying to make sure that services are available for people who may be excluded or may find access to be difficult, but nevertheless, we do pretty well. And I think we should be positive about what we've achieved rather than just being repeatedly negative. Gabriel, you did point into another issue that I don't think is necessarily COVID specific, and that is the adverse consequences that came from the 2013 restructuring that affected public health and affected the ability to coordinate and deliver immunization programs, with local authorities being separated away from public health being separated away from primary care, and so on. So I'm certain that people will look at those changes very critically when reviewing how they've impacted on the COVID vaccination, and hopefully we will see a better arrangement in the future than we are currently left with as a legacy of those 2013 changes.
Yeah, I think my difficulty is actually having run out programs in conjunction with yourself, David, in the regions of England. It's very helpful to know who's actually responsible at a local level, and it's not at all clear, I think, at the moment who is responsible. And I think we will have significant lacunae in terms of our coverage at local communities. My other question was really about the effect on other immunization programs, actually, and how things like the HPV program, and which must have been disrupted by school closure, and we were in a poor place on a whole range of public health indicators, including some declines in childhood immunization, and lost our elimination status for measles and so on. Is there should we be concerned and paying particular attention to all of those other programs, because we know that some of those are very sensitive to they require a very high level of immunization in order to be effective, and are very sensitive to change?
Of course we should be concerned, and there was evidence that coverage, for example, for MMR had dipped during the early part of the pandemic in 2020 in particular, but there were, I think, very credible efforts made to make sure that primary care could operate in a safe and effective way to get children back to be vaccinated, and the coverage data has been picking up again. You're right that immunizing in schools for HPV under the sort of social distancing and difficulties that will all bring has made for problems. I'm pretty confident that we will regain ground, and we will look back and say, yep, there were problems, and we have actually surmounted them.
Good. Thank you very much. I'll hand back to Kate.
Great. Thank you both so much for that wonderful input, Beata and David. That was really fantastic session. I felt like I learned so much during that. Hopefully, if you can stick around for a little while, then we are going to go to questions, and if there are any relevant questions, then feel free to stick up your hand and please answer those questions, because you will have better expertise than many of the people on the panel, especially me. So I'm going to hand back to Alice, who I think is going to take questions. Thanks.
Yes, and thank you very much indeed, David and Beata. That was so brilliantly informative. And if you can stick around, that'd be fantastic. We're going to take questions from press and the public now, starting with Nigel Nelson from the Sunday People. Nigel, what's your question today?
Thanks, Alice. If Indy Sage was making the announcement of changes to the roadmap on Monday, what would you guys be saying?
Thank you very much, Nigel. That's assuming there will be an announcement of changes to the roadmap.
There'll be an announcement.
Changes. Yeah. Yes. So what would we be saying, or what do we think is the most sensible way forward at the moment? Dr. Zubaida Haque.
I'm not going to go through all of the changes that we want to make, because I'm sure my colleagues will want to have some say in this as well. But for us, one of the biggest concerning areas has been the exponential growth of cases among school children with the Delta variant. We know that at the moment constitutes the highest percentage of cases. Matt Hancock himself mentioned this last week, and also mentioned that transmissibility is very high among school children. And yet they took away face masks on May the 17th, on the third stage of the roadmap. We haven't seen the evidence as to why they removed face masks from secondary schools, but it's secondary schools where we have the biggest concerns right now. So in terms of Monday, Nigel, one of the things that I would like for the government to reinstate as a first priority is face masks in secondary schools. On top of that, I think they need to address the issue of ventilation. There are no mitigation measures really in schools. We know that tests have rapidly declined, although they may have gone up slightly last week after half term. But in general, they have rapidly declined. There is no mitigation measures, and we need that to be addressed because we've still got a couple of weeks before schools close at the end of July. And I'm really concerned that schools might be closing left, right, and centre across the country at the moment. Thank you.
And what else, Dr. Kit Yates?
Hi, Nigel. I think we would be suggesting that we need to delay the last round of restrictions on the 21st of June. I think that is relatively uncontroversial. I think there's a strong scientific consensus around that. I think we would also be highlighting the things that we put out in our emergency statement last week. So encouraging things like support for isolation, ensuring good ventilations in schools and workplaces, bringing back face coverings in schools, generally more mitigations in school, comprehensive border control to ensure that we don't import or export variants of concern, trying to accelerate the vaccine program as much as possible, considering boosters for the vaccination program, and of course, as we've touched on today already, enhanced support for global vaccination. So those are all the things that I hope each and every one of us would be advocating for in the announcement on Monday.
Thank you very much, Kit. And Professor Anthony Costello, you have something to add here?
Well, just very quickly, I mean, if we've got 7,500 cases reported daily at the moment, and that's those that are actually tested. So we don't know how many others there are. Let's say it's double. There's 15,000 and we're doubling every 8 or 9 days. Then if you do the sums, in about just over a month, we'll be up at 120,000 cases a day. So that's the way it goes. Now, obviously, there are going to be effects from vaccine and immunity and stuff. But even there, we're worried about immunity because this is a very transmissible virus, which means that the coverage of vaccine could be 85% that you need to achieve at least in order to get to some kind of effective herd immunity. And if there's vaccine escape of 20%, it might be almost impossible to achieve ultimate herd immunity, although Carl may have a better answer than that. So that's why we've got to be careful. We're not arguing to go back for a big national lockdown or anything. We're saying, look, we should have been doing much better local, focus on test, trace, isolate, particularly when levels were low. And, as we know, that hasn't happened in any sense of the word, of enough people on the ground, rapid testing, and proper financial support for isolation. So if we'd done that, I think we would have a chance of slowing that rise and allowing us to catch up with vaccines. So that's the dilemma the government's in. If they take a gamble and say, no, we're going to let it rip like a lot of the Tory backbenchers want, then the worry is that the association with hospitalisation hasn't been broken. And then you're going to get the NHS overloaded, and then people will get scared, and then you'll end up with a much worse economic impact. I think the general feeling is, let's wait, let's stay at step 3, let's keep measures, watch the data very carefully. And I think that's what the government's thinking about right now.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Does anybody else want to comment on that? I think that was a fairly comprehensive answer to your question there, Nigel. Thank you very much for joining us today. The next question comes from Karen Hill-Jones. Karen, over to you.
Hi. I have 2 questions. The first is it likely that vaccination could improve the health of children with long COVID in the same way that it has for some adults? And my second question is, do you think that there will be a reckoning at some point in the future when people who are children now look back and assess whether the decisions being made by our government were really being made with their best interests at heart? And what judgments do you think they will come to?
Thank you very much, Karen. So we'll start with your first question about long COVID and vaccination. And I wonder, yes, Beata, would you like to take that?
Yeah, I'm very comfortable with that question. So the first thing is, long COVID is a very ill-defined entity. So we can't really say this will manifest itself in one child in this way and another child in that way, but like the adults, right? There's a real spectrum of presentation. And we know that some people had relief of their long COVID symptoms after they had the vaccines, but there's no controlled study. And the only way you can really kind of reconcile that is long COVID is an immune dysregulation. So it can happen in many places. Can happen at the heart, can happen at the brain, can happen at the muscle system, etc. So if you give a stimulus like a vaccine, which also stimulates your immune system, that's by its very nature its job, then maybe you redress that balance, and that might lead for some people, adults and children, to some relief of their symptoms. Now, the long COVID also it doesn't necessarily go on forever. So whether the vaccine has really made the difference, or whether the entire time scale between getting vaccinated, where you are in your long COVID process, is the association is really not established. Some people have felt worse after they've had their vaccine. So it's good to now see that there are some studies who are following up children and adults with long COVID. Some of them might receive, some might not receive the vaccine. As far as I know, I don't actually know. There might even be a controlled study that try and gives the adults these vaccines. I'm not quite sure about that, but it's an immunomodulatory response that might work for some and not for others. So the jury is a bit out on that.
So the jury's out, but we are collecting data, and we should have a better answer for that question soon. Thank you very much, Beata. What about the second part of Karen's question, which was about how today's children might look back on this in, say, 10, 20, 30 years' time? Dina, did you want to talk about that?
Yes, thanks. That's a really provocative question, and thanks for the question. Briefly, I think there's two aspects in a future reckoning from current children. I mean, the first is that it is really unfortunate that children now are living through what may be once in a lifetime event, in terms of disruption, emotional, physical, and for health and society. This is on the par with great world wars. And so I think, we need to consider that that this has affected everybody, children in relation to their peers and their parents and guardians. But in terms of a reckoning, I think the second aspect is that it will be how people view this will be determined by how our society changes at the end of this pandemic. Yeah, because what the pandemic has demonstrated is that particularly this society is hugely inequitous, and the fault lines have really been blown apart. It's there now for everyone to see. In education, one can see how the haves and have-nots deal with that. We even have over the last week Boris Johnson applauding those who can afford private tuition, catch-up tuition for their children, compared to the mass of children. We know about children's parents, the haves and have-nots, how they live, how they're disproportionately affected if they're multi-generation households, if people have to go to work, and so forth. So the education service, the health service, social care, and so on. All of those things have what the pandemic has done has uncovered what is really wrong with society. And I think this is where children today in 10, 20 years will look back and say, were those lessons learned? Did society change? Was there a much more equitous way of investing both in children and all of us? And I think that will be a key aspect, as in fact has been after the Second World War, where of course society was really restructured in the UK following the war, and we live with the benefits of that now.
Thank you very much indeed, Dean and Professor Dean and Pillay. I should have introduced you. Professor Stephen Reicher, you'd like to comment here as well?
Yeah, just a couple of points. I mean, one on children and more generally on young people. During this pandemic, there's been a lot of rhetoric of blame, of people misbehaving and doing things which have spread infection and fueled the pandemic. And we've seen at various points young people being blamed. We saw it last September, October, with university students being told not to kill their grannies. And in many ways, I think one of the most remarkable things about this pandemic has been the way in which young people, by and large, have actually respected the restrictions. Even those restrictions are more onerous on them. They want to go out more than I do. Secondly, despite the fact that it wasn't so much for themselves, but for others. They had a sense that they weren't going to suffer. They did it for others. So in many ways, the contribution of young people and the levels of adherence of young people have been quite remarkable. And the reward for that is that they are going to bear the cost more than any other group in our society. We already know that from the projections in terms of unemployment, in terms of future income, and of course, even amongst young people, those who will lose out most will be those who come from more deprived backgrounds and ethnic minority backgrounds. So we have this massive irony of this remarkable contribution from young people, and yet the reward is to be punished. And I think that generational inequity is a huge issue. And when we talk about the inequities of this pandemic, quite rightly talk about social class inequities, talk about racial and ethnic inequities, talk about gender inequities, we mustn't forget that inequity to young people. And even when there are very concrete issues, like the issues about catch-up in education, then the funding that is needed is replaced by a completely paltry amount. You know, in other countries, they are putting in £2,000, £1,000 per pupil for catch-up. In the UK, we have been offered £50 per pupil for catch-up. So I think those issues of generational inequity are absolutely critical and must be put fair square in the question of how we rebuild better and how we deal with the inequities of our society. And I think we do owe a huge vote of thanks to young people, and that's got to be reflected in action, in practice, and in funding.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Dr. Tallulah Oni, you'd like to speak to this too.
I think Zubaida had a hand up before me. Just okay.
Tony, you haven't had a chance to speak. You go first.
Okay. Okay. I just wanted to pick up on the point that Dean made. You know, it is a once in a generational event we are going through at the moment, the pandemic. In 20 years, we will look back and we will recognize that we are also going through a concurrent once in a generation global emergency of climate change. It will be a lot less, it would be a lot more difficult to see the differences between our response to the pandemic and the response to that global emergency, I think, in 20 years, because we'll look back and say, okay, so we noted that there were things about how we ran society that were bad for the pandemic, but we also noticed that it was bad for the environment and for climate. And then once the pandemic was over, we went back to doing what because we thought the pandemic was over. So I think we will be, history will not look kindly upon us if we do not take the opportunity to integrate and incorporate the lessons that we've learned as part of the pandemic response that are both good for population health and good for the environment. It's 10 years. In 10 years' time, we'll be at 2030, which have a lot of the Sustainable Development Goals. We have a lot of goals to reach in terms of sustainable development. We have goals of 2040, getting to net zero carbon. There are so many parallels. When we live in the moment, we have a blinkered experience of what we're going through now. But I can almost guarantee that in 20 years' time, we will look back and we will see, okay, we were going through a pandemic and we're going through a climate emergency. How did we not integrate our responses to ensure that our society came through to be more pandemic resilient and also to be more climate resilient?
Thank you, Tolu. And Zubaida?
Just very quickly, and I know this is somewhat controversial, but I do wonder whether the government is still carrying out its ideological, natural herd immunity infection through schools. And the reason I've been wondering that, and I haven't stopped wondering it really from the beginning, is because there are no mitigations really in schools. As I mentioned very quickly at the beginning, They haven't done anything at all about ventilation, despite the fact that in the US, that schools have grading around ventilation. You can see how schools do with ventilation. But this government have done nothing around ventilations. As I mentioned, they instated school masks rather belatedly in March and then took it away in May. They haven't done anything about class bubbles. They haven't done anything about creating extra space so that children can spread out and be safe social distance wise. They haven't done anything at all. And it does beg the question why, on the one hand, we can have the Secretary of State for Health saying, yes, I'm concerned that we've got the highest infection rates among school children, but on the other hand, doing absolutely nothing to make them safe. And that ignores, of course, the issues around long COVID. That ignores especially the issues around school disruption, because it's not just about opening schools or closing schools. It's about keeping schools open.
Thank you very much, Zubaida. I think there were a lot of people last summer who expected mitigations to be placed into schools, and there was a lot of discussion going on with the unions. And I think in the end, the government simply ploughed several £1 million into a PR campaign to tell parents that schools were safe without any mitigations. Right, I'm going to move on to a question which has come in from Connell Richards, and I'm going to read it out. Why are cases decreasing in Bolton is Connor's question. And is this reason not to worry too much? So should Bolton make us optimistic? Who would like to start with that? Why are cases decreasing in Bolton, do we think? Kit, do you have any idea?
Yeah, I think there are probably a number of reasons why it's starting to come down. Bolton's been a focus of much national attention. There has been surge vaccination, there's been surge testing. I think there's probably also been behavioural change there. People are acting differently because they're aware that they're in a hotspot. I don't think that Bolton is necessarily, I don't necessarily think that that's what we can expect, the same trajectory from everywhere else in the country. I would love to hope that that would be the case, that there'll be this short uptick and then it will come down. But we mustn't forget that, vaccines have been ploughed into places like Bolton at the expense of other places in the country that were maybe slightly more vaccinated already. So I don't think that we can expect to see that being the case for everywhere across the country. And I think there are a number of reasons why Bolton's cases have started to come down, because they've been the focus of so much attention.
Thank you very much, Kit. And Professor Gabriel Scally.
One comment I wanted to make is that one of the distinguishing features of Bolton and Blackburn and one or two other places has been that they've got local directors of public health who are prepared to battle for their population and have got the local politicians on side and indeed the regional politicians on side. And you're starting to see very reasonable, rational demands coming from the local level. And I'm quite optimistic about that, but we haven't seen it in many places. I think what is disappointing is that not enough power, not enough devolved resources have been given to the local level to enable them to step up those efforts. And I do think it's disappointing also that despite the requests to have enough vaccines to be able to vaccinate everyone 18 years and older in those areas where the virus has been growing at such a rate, that hasn't been approved from the centre. And that strikes me as a very, very bad way of handling a local outbreak. And other changes are needed as well. For example, some of the testing regimes are not right, not testing close contacts. Those are the people who are at highest risk. And we're still not doing that locally. And there's much more help and support could be given to the local level. But I think a pat on the back for the local directors of public health. I'm going to stick my head out and say their efforts have made a difference.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. And Zubaida, you wanted to say something quickly here about inequality.
Yes, and it's not just about Bolton, which is, I'm extremely concerned that right from the beginning, this was a pandemic about inequality and poverty. And it showed how inequality and poverty has been amplified by this pandemic and also by some of the policies. Now, the latest figures on hospital admissions disaggregated by deprivation and ethnic groups has shown that actually the proportion of Black and ethnic minority groups in hospital admissions has increased from January from 30% of admissions to 50% of admissions. The proportion of people from deprived backgrounds in hospital admissions from January has increased from 26.6% to 47.6%. So we have more people from deprived backgrounds, or a higher proportion of people from deprived backgrounds, and a higher proportion of Black and ethnic minority groups, all of whom we knew were much more at risk from this virus ending up in hospital admissions. So this government has done nothing really to address those issues. We've known about those issues from the beginning. We know what some of the answers are in terms of helping people to self-isolate financially, providing accommodation, in terms of test and trace, taking test and trace to people. We know what a lot of the answers are, but the government haven't done anything, and hospital admission figures right now are showing it. And it's not just an issue about vaccine uptake.
Thank you very much, Zubaida. Quite shocking figures there. And we're going to move on to another question. I want to get through quite a few questions, actually. So I'm just going to ask the questioners to be very concise and to the point, and just a single question each. And I'm just going to invite a single response to each one. And then hopefully we can fit everybody in. The next one comes from Alison Tinlin. Alison.
My question.
Oh, hello.
Hi. My question is, why are weddings discriminated against and unduly restricted in disparity to the rest of society? There are hundreds of thousands of people, both wedding supplier and couples, feeling the unfairness of this just now. And while there may be some delay in the roadmap, why can't we at least have parity with what's fully open in the rest of society?
What are the current restrictions, Alison?
In England, there is 30 for a wedding. In Scotland, it's 50, but depending on the area, because it's different levels. In England, there's no dancing. You're not allowed to have your dad walk you down the aisle. They have allowed that in Scotland, but only from last Saturday. In comparison to all this, there was 18,000 people at Edgbaston at the cricket yesterday. They're allowing 22,500 at the Euros in Wembley on Sunday. And there is the Download Festival pilot within the next week or so, where they're allowing at least 10,000 people to go to that.
Okay, so quite a significant disparity there.
Yes.
Anthony, I wonder if you'd like to comment on that then. Do you think the weddings are being unfairly discriminated against with all these large-scale sporting events?
You think I'm the wedding expert? From what you say, actually, I think you've got a good argument, because, again, it's about safety here, isn't it? If you think about it, most weddings that I've been to in the summer are often largely in the open air, because you may go to, okay, you have to go to a church or an event, but you can easily get around that, and then you could have a marquee or something with an outdoor kind of, and you would think that actually we could implement some rules to make it safe, that you could have more than 30 people there. If we're going to have mass gatherings in stadia doing something similar. I mean, obviously the worry would be if it was in a very confined church hall with bad ventilation, or a pub or somewhere. So I think it being more flexible here would perhaps make sense, but I may be talking through my hat.
Yeah, you don't have to go to church to get married, Anthony, anymore. You can have humanist weddings anyway.
No, but I mean, even if you go to a registry office, you're indoors, aren't you? But you could
you can have weddings outside.
Exactly.
Solution. Yeah. Has anybody else got an idea why weddings are being unfairly discriminated against here, Kit?
I think one thing, like comparing the cricket and the Euros, these are relatively few large events, and obviously weddings are relatively many smaller events. So that's part of the reason. But just thinking about the 21st of June, loads of people have planned to get married after the 21st of June because they're expecting the restrictions to be released. And I totally feel for those people who've planned this wedding and now potentially, depending on what happens on Monday, it's going to be cancelled. And people are angry about that, and understandably. But I want to emphasize that we shouldn't be directing anger against the people who are blowing the whistle, people who are saying, look, we're going to be in real trouble if things continue. We should be directing our anger towards the government who failed to stop this Delta variant coming into the country. If we had been able to been able to keep it out of the country, then it's in all likelihood we might have been able to go ahead with this 21st of June easing of restrictions. But it really upsets me that people are going to have their plans ruined precisely because the government failed to listen to the scientists earlier on in the year.
Thank you very much, Kit. Right, another question now from Victoria Wilson. Victoria.
Hello. I hear of several people who've been double vaccinated but who now have COVID. Is it known whether vaccinations protect you from long COVID if you do become ill? And is there any difference with the different types of vaccines, or what are your thoughts if the data's not available yet?
Oh, thank you very much for your question. We've partially covered this earlier in the discussion, actually, with our experts joining us today. But I wonder if anybody on the panel would like to add a little bit more to that. Do we think that the vaccinations are going to affect long COVID or protect from it? Professor Dinan Pillay.
Thanks for that question. I'm obviously interested, and we all are, that you have been vaccinated and then I presume have had a COVID, illness which has been diagnosed as such. Of course, vaccines are not 100%, and I hope that illness, that COVID disease you had, was mild. But we talked previously, I think Beata talked about long COVID being not one entity, but a number of different things which now come under one banner of long COVID. In other words, longer term consequences of having COVID. And that basically means that if you prevent yourself getting COVID, and we protect against getting COVID, we will protect against long COVID for those aspects of long COVID that are directly due to the infection. So I think, yes, we can say quite categorically, even without trial data, that the vaccines, because we know the vaccines are effective, as we're seeing within the UK now, the proportion of those individuals getting very ill who've had both core courses of vaccine, both doses, are very low. And so I think we can be reassured that vaccination will protect against long COVID in the same way that it protects against COVID in the first place.
Thank you very much, Dinan. Here's another question from Charles Bradshaw Smith. Charles, what's your question?
Hi, I would like to come back to the question of delaying the roadmap. You talked mostly just about a delay. Is there not room for a possible compromise? Maybe we have some limited easing of measures, like we continue social distancing and face masks, but we allow social gatherings of up to 30 people.
Thank you very much. So could there be a kind of halfway house, or have we already let the brakes off too much already? I mean,
exactly.
What should we be doing? Who would like to take this first? Professor Gabriel Scally.
It's kind of a discussion I don't want to have, because it's not the discussion we should be having. It's not that trade-off thing, this into the bucket and this out of the bucket, when we're not doing the simple things and the sensible things, and haven't done lots of them. And we've talked about some of them. Ventilation, what's the point in having an argument about wearing masks inside if no one has ever made any effort to improve the ventilation? If we haven't had the investment going into ventilating our workplaces, our places of recreation, or theatres, or whatever, and we should have had a major program dealing with that. I mean, what's the point in relying on more social restriction when we're not testing? I'm like a broken record, and we don't test the close contacts of people who test positive. We just don't do it. We haven't done it. And the government has failed all the way along on a whole series of these sensible things that they should be doing. And we're also, I think, condemning a lot of communities to ongoing restriction and problems, because not doing the mitigation, and also lots of people in those communities who are not vaccinated yet. So I think that that's not the debate I would like to be having. It's not about this versus this. It's about our whole package that we need to put in place so we can get the virus suppressed and we can go about our own lives.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. And Stephen, you want to comment too? I'll let you comment on this.
I think something very significant happened yesterday at the evidence, was it yesterday or the day before, but the evidence from Matt Hancock, because it resolves a real dilemma that many of us have had about why on earth has the government never supported people to self-isolate, which is one of those things that Gabriel is referring to, the obvious things we should be doing. And if there was one thing around which there was a scientific consensus, everybody was saying, look, it's a no-brainer. You've got to support people to self-isolate. And in fact, if you look at the modeling now, how big this third wave is depends critically on behavior. And the most important aspect of that behavior in the modeling is whether people self-isolate or not. So the question is, why aren't we doing it? And Jeremy Hunt asked that question to Matt Hancock. He said, why aren't we giving people the financial and the other support they need? And Matt Hancock had the temerity to say, because we think people would game the system. They would pretend to be ill and they would give contacts who weren't ill so they could get the money to self-isolate. Now, there are a number of ironies, of course, there from a government which has gamed the system and whose cronies have gamed the system. And Hancock himself owns 20% of a company which got money from an NHS privatized contract. And they can have no understanding of the realities of self-isolation if they think that it's an easy thing that people would just do to make a few quid. It's a very difficult thing to do, which is why we should be supporting people. But most profoundly, it tells us something really deep about this government, which does not trust its own population and therefore won't do the obvious things it needs to do. And we saw that also in their explanation about not early on imposing restrictions because of their notion that the public wouldn't put up with it. The public would be too weak to put up with it. And I think one of the things we've learned is that one of the reasons why this government has been so catastrophically bad isn't because of the incompetence of a few individuals, isn't due to groupthink. It's fundamentally due to an ideology, an elitist ideology which does not trust the population. And if we had trusted the population, and if we'd worked with people, and if we'd supported people through things like self-isolation rather than threatened punishment against them if they don't self-isolate, £10,000 fines, we'd be in a far better place. So yes, we need to do the obvious things in terms of policy, but we also need a fundamental change in the government attitude so it trusts us and supports us rather than sees us as a problem and blames us, hectors us, and threatens us with punishment.
Thank you very much indeed, Stephen. Time for one final question from Nicola Careless. Nicola.
Hello. The initial question I was going to ask, I think, has already been pretty much covered about whether or not you would recommend vaccinating children that are already suffering with long COVID. I think that was pretty much already covered. However, I'm a member of the long COVID kids support group, and the biggest problem I would say that we probably have as a group is parents and children not being believed about their illness. Many of our members cite that when they're seeing GPs and paediatricians, they're being, told it's anxiety, it's psychosomatic, it's in the head, or that the parents themselves or mothers particularly are suffering from Munchausen's by proxy, which obviously is incredibly distressing and upsetting. So how can we as parents change that narrative and change that thought that GPs and paediatricians have, that this is something that's in the children's head or in our heads?
Thank you very much for that question, and that's quite distressing to hear that the parents are not being taken seriously. How can we change this? I mean, this is about better listening. I think groups like Long COVID Kids are useful in raising awareness. Anthony.
Yeah, I think this is a really big issue. I mean, I don't share the view that, as we've heard earlier, that this is a trivial illness in childhood. I mean, figures I'm hearing, 8 to 10% of children that get infected do have long COVID symptoms, which last for many weeks. And we still don't know exactly how long this is all going to last for, and whether this will become recurrent and the like. And of course, the symptoms are non-specific, like chronic fatigue syndrome, although the cause is different. And as Beata said earlier, this is an effect on your immune system that changes things in ways we don't fully understand. And it's not surprising that, I had a personal case where my wife developed a clot in her heart and had a heart attack after a COVID infection. And the cardiologist, when we raised it, just said, "Oh, no, it's nothing to do with that. We've done a test," even though she'd had it, 5 weeks earlier, and the test would inevitably be negative. So it is a problem. And sometimes, GPs, doctors, even experts are slow to catch up on things. And so we have to get that information out. It is difficult. We need the research studies to be done and to be followed up with cohorts of children. And you need to sometimes have to argue your case quite forcefully. And I think there is a growing awareness now that this really is a problem. And many GPs are superb at handling this. So if you've got a particularly resistant one, it might be worth going to see someone else.
Thank you very much, Anthony, for brilliant kind of personal advice on how to deal with that as well, but also just the general advice that we need to listen better and raise awareness of this issue. I think that is it, folks. We don't have any more time, so I'm going to thank everybody. Thanks to our special guests today, Professor Beata Kampmann and Professor David Salisbury. Thank you to all the independent SAGE scientists who are continuing to volunteer their time and their expertise to engage with the public during this pandemic and bringing the latest scientific perspective to you, the latest facts and figures, as well as answering questions and listening to your concerns. This dialogue is really important. As well as our weekly briefings, Independent SAGE has produced many, many reports. All of those are up on the website. And also a new statement on the Euros. So that's just gone up there on the website as well. Thank you very much for all of your questions today. Thank you for watching. Do follow Independent SAGE on Twitter and Instagram if you don't already. I'm going away filming some archaeology for 2 weeks now, but Independent SAGE won't stop. So I won't be here next Friday, but everybody else will. Same time, same place. Stay safe. Keep well.
Thank you.